Good day. In this channel, over the last year, I have been concentrating on two major crises which constitute the major flashpoints or points of tension between the three great powers, the United States specifically, as it finds itself in growing confrontation with the other two nuclear superpowers, Russia and China. And the two crises, the 2 points of crises, have been Ukraine and Taiwan. We saw a major exacerbation of the Ukrainian crisis in April when Ukraine moved troops to the contact line separating Ukraine from the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, with wild talk in Ukraine that many interpreted as signaling preparations for the launch of an offensive, and which provoked the Russians to a major military build-up along Ukraine's borders, with Russian counter-threats that a war in Ukraine would end with the destruction of Ukraine. That crisis in April was eventually diffused as a result of diplomatic action, specifically as a result of President Biden's telephone call at the worst point of the crisis, when President Biden telephoned Vladimir Putin of Russia and agreed a summit meeting with Putin in Geneva, a summit meeting which proved entirely aimless and without point, but which did in the event manage to cool down the situation in Ukraine. Since then, over the last few weeks, and as I discussed in a recent video, the situation in Ukraine has begun to exacerbate again, because despite the conversations that took place between Putin and Biden in April and in Geneva in June, the underlying problems in Ukraine have not been solved. The other crisis, perhaps an even more dangerous crisis, is the crisis over Taiwan, where the authorities in Taiwan have been agitating increasingly for outright independence from China, and a declaration of outright independence from China, something which the Chinese have made clear they will never accept and take military action to prevent, and which the United States has steadily drifted into a situation where it appears to be making a commitment to defend Taiwan and appears to be quietly supporting Taiwan's steps towards declaring itself independent from China. That, it seems to me, is the other great point of international tension between the three great powers. There is, however, a third point of tension, and that's the one I'm going to discuss today, which is briefly the standoff between the United States and Israel and Iran in the Middle East. And here, the situation also is becoming extremely and increasingly tense. Now, going back a few years, back in 2009, President Obama of the United States, at that time, negotiated with Iran a deal to place restrictions on Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Now, there's been much discussion and much debate about what the purpose of this nuclear enrichment program is. The Israelis and some people in the United States and in the West speak of it as intended eventually to develop a nuclear bomb. Iran categorically denies this. It says that it is enriching uranium, firstly because it has a right as a sovereign state to do it, and secondly because it needs enriched uranium to develop the civilian parts of its economy. I'm not going to go into this debate about Iran's objectives in this program. All I would say is that, in my opinion, Iran did have an active nuclear weapons program in the 1990s, but it was intended to provide Iran with a nuclear capability in case Saddam Hussein's Iraq did the same thing. In other words, it was to provide Iran with insurance and a capability that they might have used against Iraq in the event that Saddam Hussein and Iraq were able to develop a nuclear capability of their own. I think the Iranians were very alarmed when they discovered, following the first Gulf War of 1991, that how close Saddam Hussein and Iraq had come to developing a nuclear capability. They'd fought a ferocious war against Iraq in the 1980s, and they were, I think, determined that if Saddam Hussein did develop a nuclear capability, they would be ready with one too. I think that after Saddam Hussein fell, following the American invasion in 2003, the Iranian nuclear program was frozen, but the Iranians have always maintained a nuclear enrichment capability as insurance in case they decide that there is an urgent need to restart it. That is a complicated topic. I'm not going to discuss it further, nor am I going to discuss further the various fatwas which have been made by Ayatollah Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. All I would say is that, in my opinion, they are not quite as definitive as some people think they are. That's all I'm going to say about those. Anyway, in 2009, Barack Obama agreed with the Iranians a deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, whereby Iran agreed to freeze its nuclear enrichment at certain levels, allow intrusive inspections, and in return the United States committed itself to lifting certain of the sanctions which it had imposed on Iran. This agreement, the JCPOA, was well received internationally. It was backed by Russia and China, and it was backed by the European Union. However, in 2018, as is well known, Donald Trump went back on it and decided to cancel the JCPOA, with the result that the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, though Iran for a time went through the motions of appearing to comply with it. Over the last few years, however, Iran has gradually increased its nuclear enrichment levels as the United States has reimposed relentless sanctions upon Iran. And during the time of Donald Trump's administration, the United States, in particular the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, made a series of extraordinary demands on Iran, saying that these sanctions would only be lifted if Iran were to carry out such extensive changes to its foreign and defense policies as would in practice mean that those policies would have to be abandoned completely, with Iran in effect becoming a client state of the United States, and with other officials of the US government, including officials in the State Department, making fairly clear that the underlying objective was regime change. Anyway, that was the position a few years ago under the Trump administration. Joe Biden fought the 2020 election, saying that he thought this policy that Donald Trump had initiated, this pullout from the JCPOA, which Obama began negotiations for in 2009 and which culminated in the JCPOA agreement of 2012, Biden gave every impression that he disagreed with Trump on this question and that he would take the United States back into the JCPOA, and that we would, in effect, return to the status quo as it existed under the Obama administration. In the event, that has not happened. There have been a series of inconclusive talks in Vienna between the United States and Iran, brokered by the European Union, in which it's become absolutely clear that the United States is not interested in returning to the JCPOA, as it existed and as it had been negotiated by Barack Obama. Instead, very much like the Trump administration, the United States wants Iran to make significant changes to the JCPOA, amounting to very substantial concessions. It wants Iran to abandon specifically its ballistic missile program and in effect terminate its support for various militia groups across the Middle East. In other words, it wants essentially the same things from Iran that the Donald Trump administration had previously demanded. And Iran has predictably refused to go along with this. Iran, as a matter of fact, recently even tested the goodwill of the Biden administration by asking apparently a formal question about whether if Iran reverted to nuclear enrichment levels that it had agreed under the JCPOA and the United States lifted sanctions, whether the United States would be prepared to commit that those sanctions would not be reimposed for so long as the Biden administration was still in office. And the administration, the US government, wasn't even prepared to commit to that. So in light of all of this, it's fair to say that the negotiations to return to the JCPOA appear to be going nowhere, and Iran gradually, step by step, has been increasing its enrichment levels and has also at the same time been restricting some of the inspections that were taking place and which it had previously committed itself to under the JCPOA. So the result is deadlock and a growing sense that the JCPOA is dying. Now, I've set the scene in this discussion. I think now it's perhaps better to turn to what I think the real source of the crisis is, at least the current crisis, which is the change of the situation in Iran itself. Now, it's important, I think, at this point, to discuss why Iran decided to agree to the JCPOA in the first place. Doing so was not uncontroversial in Iran. But the then president, Hassan Rouhani, and various more liberal figures within Iran supported the JCPOA because they saw the JCPOA as a mechanism for reintegrating Iran in the global economy. The global economy means, of course, the economic system, the international economic system dominated by the United States. And they saw that as the route to stabilizing the Iranian economy, which has suffered from high inflation problems and shortages over many years, and that this was their route towards economic stabilization. Rouhani and the people who are around him, it's also fair to say, represent a section of Iranian society and of the business community which hanker for reintegration in the world economy and which want to see Iran become a country that is accepted in the international community and which can trade freely around the world and can participate actively in the Western-dominated economic systems, allowing people like Rouhani supporters, middle-class supporters, to travel to the West, to take scholarships in American and West European universities, to go on trips to Paris and New York, to live, in other words, the kind of lifestyle that many people in the West live under. But it's also fair to say that there is another community of people in Iran, a grouping which is now represented by the new Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, which see things quite differently. They believe that this attempt to reach prosperity and economic stabilization by striking some kind of deal with the United States and the West is a fool's errand, because the United States will never agree to the kind of arrangement that Rouhani and the liberals like him hanker for. They will always demand concessions from Iran, concessions which are ultimately incompatible with Iran's sovereignty and its independence, and indeed with the entire survival of Iran as an Islamic republic. And moreover, Raisi and his supporters believe that the problems in the Iranian economy will not be solved through some kind of global deal with the West. They see these attempts to strike that deal via the JCPOA and other mechanisms as a distraction from the hard work that needs to be done to create domestic economic structures within Iran itself that will make it possible for Iran to develop its economy successfully, to rein in inflation, to bring the situation in the economy under control, to carve out a path for Iran's prosperity. They see these things as needing to be done domestically and not through some kind of grand bargain with the West. On the contrary, they see these attempts to carve out that grand bargain with the West both as a fool's errand and ultimately as a distraction. Their criticism of Rouhani and of people like Rouhani is that they spend all their time negotiating with the West to no useful purpose or effect, even as the situation in Iran's economy deteriorates, and that they are neglecting the kind of steps which could be taken within Iran to bring the problems of the economy under control and to forge a stable economic way forward. And people like Raisi and people like him, moreover, argue that the idea of seeking a grand bargain with the West is in any event out of date and misjudged. The United States and its allies no longer dominate the world economy as they once did. There is an alternative. The alternative is to forge closer economic and trading relations with the Eurasian bloc, with China and Russia, to try to integrate Iran's economy with that bloc. And that, taken together with the carrying out of necessary economic changes within Iran itself, would be a much better way of developing Iran's economy, and at the same time it would safeguard Iran's sovereignty and independence. I should say that there is in the West a tendency to talk about Rouhani and his followers as liberals and to Raisi and his followers as conservatives. And there is some truth to this. It's probably true to say that Rouhani has a more liberal view on social questions than Raisi does. But on economic matters, I think this doesn't actually take us very far. It would be perhaps more useful to talk about Rouhani and his grouping as free market neoliberals in their economic ideas with a globalist agenda, and Raisi and his followers as sovereigntists and people who believe that the solution to Iran's problems depend upon Iran acting like an independent country and seeking its own solutions. So that, it seems to me, is a more accurate way of understanding the divisions within Iran. Now, given that this is so, it's perhaps unsurprising that Iran itself has started to shift away from seeking that grand bargain with the West since Ebrahim Raisi became president a few months ago, with the result that the negotiations for Iran and the United States to resume the arrangements of the JCPOA seem to be gradually ebbing away, with Iran becoming increasingly less interested. Since Raisi and the people around him do not see the JCPOA as the key to unlocking the door that will lead to Iran's prosperity, they're not so interested in negotiating a return to it. And the United States, the Biden administration, which I suspect assumed when it came to office that Iran, out of a desperation to lift the sanctions, would come round and would make substantial concessions and changes to the JCPOA to get the concessions lifted. The administration, I think, has become increasingly alarmed as it realizes that that isn't going to happen, and that Iran, in fact, is losing interest in the JCPOA and is looking for economic alternatives, is starting to pursue economic policies which will conceivably not only lead to an economic stabilization within Iran itself, but which could also result in Iran integrating with the Eurasian community, with the Eurasian powers, with China and Russia. And I think what has added to the concern is opinion polling that has now been carried out in Iran by various American agencies, including, importantly, by the University of Maryland's Center for International and Security Studies. And this opinion poll, was conducted in conjunction with the Toronto-based Iran poll, and the results have been recently published, and they make, I suspect, alarming reading for some people in the United States, because they show that Raisi's policies of focusing on sorting out the problems in Iran itself and on integration with Eurasia, as opposed to seeking a return to the JCPOA and negotiating a lifting of sanctions with the West, the previous policy associated with Rouhani, what they show is that Raisi's policies are actually popular, much more popular than Rouhani's are. And first of all, we find that there is considerable disillusionment in Iran with the Biden administration. They say that apparently only 37% of Iranians trust the United States to live up to its obligations under the nuclear agreement, if there is a return to the nuclear agreement. Asked to rate Biden's policies, rated from a 0 of completely hostile to a 10 of completely friendly, 67% of respondents provided a score in the range of 0 to 4, more than half of whom, 33.5%, chose 0. As for Raisi, by contrast, it turns out that there is solid support for him. There appears to be a fairly common view that Raisi's policies will in fact lead to lower inflation. So there's 72.8% expressed confidence in Raisi's ability to significantly lower inflation. 67.3% thought that Raisi would be more successful in reducing unemployment, and 83.8% thought that Raisi would be more successful in dealing with the pandemic than Rouhani was. So this is quite a remarkably strong support for Raisi, and it turns out that his favourability rating at the moment is 78%. So he appears to have very solid support within Iranian society. 77% of Iranians expressed confidence that he would eventually be a successful leader. And perhaps even more interesting is that on foreign policy orientation, 54.1% of Iranians said Iran should try to strengthen its relations with Asian countries such as Russia, China, and India, as against 39.1% who preferred Iran to focus on trying to improve relations with the European states. And it turns out that there is much more sympathy, much more favorability for China and Russia than there is for the United States. So views of China and Russia amongst Iranians were 57.4% favorable for China, 56.1% favorable for Russia. By contrast, the United States was viewed unfavorably by 85.3% of Iranians. So this is Raisi's policies are popular, and he's already had one important success, because Iran, at the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Dushanbe in Tajikistan, was formally admitted into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian grouping led by China and Russia, as a full member state. And that seems to suggest that Iran is gradually inching its way towards becoming a full member of the Eurasian community. So all of this is, of course, extremely concerning, because it argues that the policy that the United States has been following, both under the Trump administration and under the Biden-Harris administration, of imposing sanctions against Iran and of hoping that those sanctions will either lead to radical changes in Iran's foreign and security policies, or alternatively to a major uprising that will lead to the fall of the government, that those policies are simply not working. What they have led to instead is a situation where Iran has shifted away from seeking some kind of rapprochement with the West, is losing interest in the JCPOA, and is instead integrating with the Eurasian countries, with China and Russia, and with their regional groupings, and that it is the policy of the Iranian government in doing that is actually popular. Moreover, and this is something which I think a lot of people perhaps are not aware of, the recent rise in oil prices has also provided a further boost to Raisi. Economic growth in Iran this year has been around 6%. This has come after several years of contraction, after severe economic problems. So a 6% growth rate isn't going to dramatically change the living situation, the living conditions of Iranians. But it does mean that Iranians are probably starting to sense an improvement in their economic conditions. And this probably, to some extent at least, explains the high favorability rating that Raisi currently enjoys. So, all of this, it seems to me, is causing concern because the policy, the hardline policy of trying to push Iran either into major concessions or perhaps to provoke an uprising in Iran, is achieving the opposite of what it was intended to do. Iranian society appears to be consolidating around Raisi and his more sovereigntist, nationalist grouping, one which is more suspicious of the West and one which seeks to pursue an entirely different economic policies from those of Rouhani, one which, instead of wanting to integrate Iran into the globalist system, seek instead to pursue a sovereigntist path, and which at the same time seeks rapprochement with the Eurasian powers as opposed to the West. And to add to all of this, there's now growing rumours, in fact they're not rumours, they're almost certainly realities, that Iran is now working steadily towards an arms deal with Russia at the same time as it agreed a massive investment program with China. Now, the investment program with China, we don't actually have as many of the details as some people think, but there have been suggestions that it could, over the entire period of its existence, amount to a global Chinese investment in Iran's economy, amounting to something like $400 billion, which would, of course, transform the economic situation in Iran radically. And it seems that there is also a big arms deal with Russia in pending. The Iranian defense minister was recently in Moscow, where he held discussions with the Russian leadership. We don't know what was discussed exactly, but the most likely prospect is that there were discussions about a major upgrade of Iran's air defense system, and in particular its air force, which is in very bad shape, based around aircraft left over from the era of the Shah, supplemented with a few Soviet fighters that were acquired from Saddam Hussein as a result of the wars that took place in Iran in the 1990s and early 2000s. So the Iranians have been long hankering to upgrade their air force, and it's widely believed that they're interested in buying fighter jets from Russia, and it could be that they might be interested, for example, in buying the new Sukhoi 5th generation light fighter, the Checkmate fighter, which the Russians displayed at the Max Air Show back in August. So all of this is deeply alarming. And how does the United States react to this? Well, at the moment, all the indications are that we've gone from a situation of relative engagement with Iran at the start of this year, in the belief that if the United States took a hard line, the Iranians would fold, to a policy now of outright confrontation. And the latest reports that we've been getting is that the United States, together with Israel, launched another major cyber attack on Iran over the last few weeks, one which closed down many Iranian gas stations, complicating the situation in Iran even further. And there's also, of course, been more talk about Israeli strikes on Iran. And recently, just the other day, we had those very dramatic pictures of a US B-1 bomber being escorted by Israeli fighter jets. So it's beginning to look as if the idea of a military strike on Iran, which has been circulating for a long time, but we might be edging closer to the point where that becomes a reality. Now, I have to say, I'm not quite sure that that's going to happen. And if it does happen, I am not absolutely certain what the effect will be. One shouldn't either underestimate Iran or overestimate Iran's power. The Iranians have, for example, at various times spoken about closing the Straits of Hormuz if they are attacked. That might be an option, but I would have thought that they would want to leave that idea to the end, to wait until things become extremely critical before doing something which would be enormously dramatic and which could, of course, create chaos across the entire world economy, but which would also provoke a massive reaction against Iran from the United States and perhaps other powers. It seems to me perhaps a more likely response from the Iranians would be to absorb any strike, but at the same time to make preparations to increase the cost for the United States specifically, with perhaps attacks on American personnel across the Middle East. I don't want to say too much about this because I don't know very much about these matters, and I don't want to speculate about things of that nature that I don't really know very much about, and I don't want to put too many ideas into people's heads anyway. But no doubt, I am sure that the Iranians have a toolkit of things that they could do, and I'm also fairly sure that they've already prepared their responses. So I think that this is now a situation where, rather than looking at an immediate, out of control, global conflict between Iran and the United States and Israel, we could be seeing a steady rise in tensions, perhaps a steady rise in conflict situations, perhaps Israeli strikes on Iran, perhaps Iranian counterstrikes across the Middle East, a steady ramping up of tension across the Middle East. In consequence, more disruption, more chaos, and more violence across the Middle East. An unattractive and worrying picture. But it is a disturbing situation, and there are reports that the Israelis have now acquired very powerful bunker-busting bombs from the United States, and that they're training increasingly on launching a strike against Iran, and that they are only now, what they're now holding out for are larger aircraft, bomber aircraft, such as would be capable of carrying out these strikes. And it could be, for example, that the United States might lend some B-1 bombers to Israel briefly in order to carry out these strikes with these heavy bombs, because apparently these Israeli aircraft aren't the aircraft in Israel's current air force are not large enough to carry these big bombs. So that would be a dangerous escalation, an extraordinary escalation. But one is starting to get reports that start to hint at that sort of thing. Well, all I will say about this is that we have a crisis in Ukraine against Russia. We have a crisis involving China around Taiwan. Do we really want to add a further crisis with Iran? Surely we do not, especially given the implications for the world economy at this time. But it seems to me that we are starting to edge towards that point. A point, by the way, which is fair to point out that the previous president, Donald Trump, never let himself reach. He always pulled back and sought negotiations with the Iranians rather than escalate to the point where that situation ever arose. If we do find ourselves in that kind of confrontation in the Middle East, but especially if it turns out to be a long drawn out one, as I think is highly likely, then as I said, I think that's going to be disastrous. I'm going to add, by the way, that I don't think Iranian society would crack under that kind of stress. I think, on the contrary, that it would further consolidate, behind Raisi's government. And I think we could very well see in that sort of situation that Iran would escalate in all kinds of its ways of its own in a situation which would be extremely grave internationally and for the situation in the Middle East. I would add, by the way, and in addition, that Iran has experience of dealing with heavy bombing campaigns, including on its most sensitive installations. During the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, Saddam Hussein's Air Force carried out long-range strikes, often with heavy bombers, often with very powerful bunker-busting bombs on Iranian cities and Iranian installations. Iran survived that campaign. Indeed, it came out from that campaign not just intact, but in some way stronger. And it was, of course, a weaker country in the 1980s than it is today. I am fairly sure that Iran would be able to come through whatever it is that the United States and Israel might want to throw at it. Moreover, though I accept that it's quite likely that the United States and Israel are fairly well informed about the nature of Iran's installations, and though I also accept that the Israelis probably do have the capability to do real damage to these installations, I suspect that it will probably be very, very difficult to knock out the entire Iranian nuclear program entirely. And of course, the risk is that the opposite might happen. The Israelis might instead accelerate and intensify it. Certainly, a military conflict between Iran and Israel and the United States will be deeply unpopular with the Eurasian powers, and we would see them consolidate their support for Iran in that kind of situation. So it seems to me that this kind of conflict that we seem to be slowly edging towards is probably the worst possible thing that we could do. But there it is. It seems to me, messed up the negotiations for the JCPOA. It might have been better, actually, if the JCPOA had never been agreed at all. At least at that point, there would have been clear dividing lines and probably less cause for an escalation of the sort we're seeing now. But regardless, it seems to me that just in the same way that the United States finds it very difficult to extricate itself from the Ukrainian problem and seems to be drifting into a confrontation with Russia there, and just as it is most definitely drifting into a confrontation with China over Taiwan, so it is gradually drifting into a confrontation with Iran in support of Israel. I find all of this appalling. I find it incredibly misjudged and misconceived, but there it is. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope there is more method to this and more wisdom, and that people will pull back before they reach that point. But I have to say it as it is, or at least as it seems to me, and it seems to me at the moment that the situation is looking increasingly grave. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel. Please also remember to check us out on our other platforms, especially Locals, where Alex and I are increasingly uploading content which is exclusive to Locals, and where I've recently been doing live streams. In fact, I'm planning to do another live stream on Locals next week. And if you join us on Locals, look out for my notification. And at the same time, you'll find that many of our community on Locals are also uploading and publishing on Locals in our community page exclusive content of their own. You're welcome to join and to publish whatever material you want to publish there. And also, in addition to that, please look us up on our various other platforms: BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, Rumble. Rumble, of course, is now teamed up with Locals, and of course the new free speech platform SuperU. And if you like the work we do, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also, please remember to go to our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our great magic mugs, the best magic mugs in the world, our Duran hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all of superb quality, 100% cotton in terms of the clothing, beautiful porcelain in terms of the mugs, embroidery rather than just printing. We went for quality products, quality merchandise, and you won't find anything better than what we sell. And by the way, I should say that the feedback we get on our products has been exceptionally positive. So come to our shop, support us also that way, support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, join us on our other platforms, come to my channel, come to our main channel, look up Alex's channel, join us on Locals, check your subscription to this channel, and tick the like button to this video if you've liked it. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day. Until then.